Hello and welcome to Lydia's Interests, the channel where I share my interests, including a monthly project video and weekly Minecraft videos. This week, part 1 of my sewing machine obsession. This video will be a history of sewing machines, although I'll probably be talking more about sewing machines after this video, including about the individual histories of my sewing machines and maybe some projects to do with the sewing machines. Also, I am not a historian. This is a research project I am doing for fun. Sources will be in the description, but don't trust that I know what I'm talking about. Although, I will say that most of my information will be aligned with what the internet will tell you on random blogs and articles. So, it's going to be as good as I can get there. I believe it is important to begin with some context. Sewing is ancient, with a quick Google search suggesting that needles of bone and wood have been found to be originated around 50,000 years ago. But sewing was a tedious job for a very long time, as anyone who has ever attempted to hand sew anything substantial can attest to. Of course, there are other forms of making clothes, such as knitting or crochet, although the invention of crochet, I quickly googled it, and it seems to be a lot closer to modern days than anticipated, but the first Google just gave me completely contradictory information, so I don't know. This is not a video about the history of crochet, so not important right now. But sewing is especially important for structured clothing, so if you want to make anything that holds shape is important, because obviously if you've ever knitted or crocheted, things like that tend to be a bit stretchy, so if you want anything fancy and structured, then sewing is important. By the time of the invention of the sewing machine, machines for the aid of making clothes have been established. In fact, the knitting machine was invented in 1589 by William Lee, which is very early, I think. Like, that seems like such a long time, especially with the Industrial Revolution only really starting in about 1750. I mean, it was 150 years before the Industrial Revolution that the knitting machine was invented, so that's fascinating. Let's start with the history of the sewing machine properly. The first important step on the invention of sewing machine was on June 24, 1755, when Charles Friedrich Weisenhall patented the two-point needle. A regular needle used for hand sewing has a point on one end. Just to quickly try and explain what I'm talking about. When Charles Friedrich Weisenhall patented the two-point needle, this refers to the fact that if you look at a regular hand sewing needle, let's see if that hopefully focuses. I don't know until I watch this back. But this needle has a hole on this end and a point on this end. So Charles Friedrich Weisenhall specifically made a needle that has a point on both ends. Also, this is a rather large hole for a hand sewing needle, but this is just what I had on hand. And this is relevant because he patented it specifically saying that it is a that is a needle made for machine use. And this is also relevant because if you look at a sewing machine needle, it is different from a regular needle, with the fact that on a regular hand sewing needle you have the point on the opposite end to the hole. With a sewing machine needle you have the point on the same end as the hole. So him patenting a two-end-pointed needle would sort of pave the way for this type of needle. I am actually fascinated by the fact that it was patented though, because it just seems like such a small difference. I suppose it's patented because he specifically mentioned that it was supposed to be used for machines, but there's no evidence of him actually making one. The only thing that could suggest to me is either he had a machine that he was working on or wanted to work on, but didn't, or maybe he thought that someone would and wanted to have the patent for this type of needle in case anyone made a sewing machine so he could get money from it. But nothing came of this, if my ideas are correct. But if anyone has any other information or ideas, I'd love to hear it. My information about this comes from a website called Fiddlebase, which was very useful for my research because they have images of patents, so hopefully I'll be able to include a bit of that on here. It doesn't have all of the patents. It is a very useful website, even though it is covered in ads. So, but needs to run somehow with the capitalist world we live in. So since it's free to use, I guess it has to have ads. But the next stage is the first sewing machine design we know about. Thomas Saint designed a sewing machine in 1790 He patented 3 machines at once, including one that was for the use in stitching, quilting, or sewing. But it's not certain if he ever built it. Personally, I would assume that he would make a machine before patenting it, but it's sort of suggested that he didn't, because he never moved on with it at all. And then in 1874, when the patent was refound, it was buried with patents about books. So when the patent was refound in 1874, after machines had already been used, Newton Wilson built the machine based on patent, but it needed modifications to work, which implies that either Thomas Saint never built it or he didn't know how to finish it. I was going to go... This model that was built in 1874 is in the Science Museum in London, and I was going to go see it and take pictures, but when I went on my trip to London, it turned out that it had been moved to Sweden, I think, from my understanding. So that's unfortunate. Then, but let's move on to the next section. So, in 1804, Thomas Stone and James Henderson built a machine and patented it, which I found a supposed image on ResearchGate, but I can't find any more information on it, especially because despite both of these men being British, they patented their machine in France, and obviously wherever the patent comes from, you can find more information in that language, and I don't speak French, so that's a bit of an issue. And then also in 1804, John Duncan, who we'll come back to later because there was a lawsuit situation, but in Scotland he supposedly patented an embroidery machine, but I can't find any evidence of this patent. And the stitching apparently wasn't consistent, but yeah, there's basically no evidence that I can find of either an image of the machine or a patent, which is generally when I feel comfortable talking about it as fact, and I'd like to mention it if I can't find either an image or a patent, or a supposed image of a patent. So that's 1804. And then in 1807, John Madisberger started building a sewing machine. He presented it to the Austrian government and got funding for it in 1814, and he stopped working on it in 1839 when he completed a machine that imitates weaving using a chain stitch. One of his models is in the Technical Museum in Vienna, apparently. Again, haven't been there, but there are images of it. And there is also a sewing machine museum named after him in Kufstein, Austria. I'd love to go there one day. And one day I will probably end up going on a Europe-wide trip, just travelling to see every single sewing machine exhibit that I can get my hands on. But yeah, moving on. If we go back in time a bit to, as I started this with him starting his sewing machine in 1807, we then go on to 1810 with Balthasar Krems, who built a machine exclusively for sewing hat caps. And despite its limited use, I would argue it's the first sewing machine we have that worked consistently as far as we know. He never patented it, so a lot of information is unknown, but there is a surviving model, supposedly, in the Eiffel Museum in Mayen, which that's on my list of places to go, as well as a model at the Germany Museum in Munich, although I can't find any information about it on their website, nor can I find an image of it whenever I look for information on the Eiffel Museum, because they don't even have a website, so that's unfortunate. Interestingly enough, I did go to the Germany Museum in Munich a few years ago, but that was before sewing machines consumed my every waking thought. So I only really went to... The only really parts of that I can remember are the robot exhibit and the aircraft exhibit, which is sad, because, yeah, I wish I knew that I needed this information so I could have seen it. And moving on, in 1818, America joined the race, supposedly, with Reverend John Adams Dodge and John Knowles making a machine, though apparently it did not sew consistently, and just like John Duncan in 1804, I cannot find any actual evidence of this machine. No images, no patent, but I did find a mention on one website of a Reverend John Adams Dodge in the early 1800s, and on a different website I found a claim. Here's the problem, I don't think I saved this website, so I can't prove this, but I found a claim that the reason he never patented his machine is because his bishop or whoever was above him in the church told him not to, because, I don't know, but apparently he wasn't allowed to by his church. If that doesn't make sense, I don't know anything about the church, and I am regurgitating information I found on a website. Hi Clackhead, you want to be part of this video? Do you have anything to say about sewing machines? Yeah, you have information? Can you give me the information? Do you know about the American sewing machine? Also, this is my conspiracy theory, is that this never happened, and this is just the Americans trying to pretend that they have a foot in the race before a proper machine was made, one that actually worked consistently. If not, the Johns here, as in Adams, Dodge, Knowles, but also Duncan from earlier, they need to get better at documenting their inventions. So that's my thoughts. Okay, so moving on. I've also found a mention of a Henry Lye in 1826 patenting a leather sewing machine, a machine for sewing leather, but no more information about that. But here's where we get the real start of the sewing machine as I would probably define it. In 1829, Bartholomew Thiomier, this is a French name, so I'm sorry for my pronunciation, produced the first practical wide-use sewing machine. Obviously we had the Krems machine before, which was practical, but it wasn't wide-use because it could only sew hat caps. What are you discussing? Do you want to come up here? What's up? Okay. We had the Krems machine before, and 1829, Thiomier made a machine that did a chain stitch. Similar to Saint's beforehand, but obviously Saint's machine didn't really work. So the machine was patented on July 17th, 1830, with Auguste Fernand drawing up the design while Thiomier wrote out the patent. And here's a story that I heard in the Sewing Machine Museum in London. Although I didn't manage to go on it during my sewing machine trip to London this time, I have been to the Sewing Machine Museum previously. Quack it, leave my papers alone. But yeah, the story I heard is that basically Thiomier... Quack it, you're messing up the camera. Okay, you're reading my hand. Good. Good plans. You wanna know the story? Okay, no, you wanna eat my hand. Thiomier patented this machine and then got a deal from the French government to produce machines in a factory and then to produce French military uniforms. And once the factory was made, the tailors heard about it in France and they were mad because they claimed the machine was taking their job. And so they decided to go down, storm the building, and burn it down. When they burnt it down, they burnt down all the machines, because the machines were wooden at the time mostly. Obviously there were metal elements, but mostly they were wooden. And Thiomier only got a couple of machines out, if more than one. And then the French government gave him the deal again. He tried again, and once again the tailors came and destroyed the factory. But in between building the two factories, he got a message from a factory in Argentina asking for more information about the machine so that they could decide if they wanted to buy some. And, his last project being burnt down, he decided to send them an entire machine and also the paperwork for how it worked to Argentina. Nothing came of that because obviously the other factory got burnt down and it all went badly, and he ended up dying a pauper in England. But yeah, they did. But this is relevant because in the 1990s, over 150 years later, a couple bought an old shirt factory, and in the storeroom they found a machine, and obviously they worked out what it was from the paperwork, and they announced that this happened, and they claimed they didn't want to sell it for a year until after that year they said that they basically just told the people who were interested in it to do an auction amongst themselves. So they did the auction and they sold it to the man in charge of the Sewing Machine Museum in London. So that is where the only known example of the original Thiomier machine is, apparently. And yeah, I think it's fascinating. The story that it was lost for such a long time. It was also the most expensive sewing machine ever sold at the time. I believe it's been beaten out now by the sewing machine that belonged to Queen Victoria's daughter. That, or it's the other way around. That Queen Victoria's daughter's machine was the most expensive until it got usurped by Tiame's machine. I can't actually recall because I was told this at my previous trip to the sewing machine museum, and like I said, I didn't manage to go this time. If I did, I'd have the details clearer, and also how much it cost, but I don't remember that. Also, the fact that they were like, we don't want to sell it for a year, and then told them to auction it does sort of sound like they were waiting for everyone who wanted to have it to find out about it, which is smart. Are you back in? Pick. Are you in or out? It's too loud out there for me to do this. Okay, have fun. Tiame was the first to make a practical wide-use sewing machine, but not one that actually sold a lot. In 1832, 2 years after Tiame's machine was patented, American Walter Hunt made a machine and sold individual ones, but he didn't patent his designs until 1854, after others started large-scale productions. In 1841, Newton and Archibald made a machine with an eye-point needle and 2 pressing surfaces. I can't find any actual evidence of this, like with some other previous ones, but it is said in many blogs and articles. The eye-point needle is important for a similar reason as the double-point needle of Weisenthal. The 2 surfaces refer to a bottom surface on which the fabric lies, and a second surface which holds on top to hold the fabric in place. In most machines in history, this is both now and in history, this is a pressure foot. I don't know if that's what it was in this original one. Also, I have found reference on some older machines, some of the first machines having fabric vertically rather than horizontally. So it wouldn't be top and bottom, but left and right. What's up? Oh, you want to leave again? He would very much like me to keep the door open, but I'm not until I finish recording this, because there is noise downstairs and it's already disrupted some of my video, I know. In 1844, John Fisher and James Gibbons built a sewing machine which used an eye-point needle carrying one thread and a shuttle carrying the other to make a double loop chain stitch. It was intended to embroider and make lace rather than sew, but it could be adapted to do that. And together with John Duncan's machine, which was also designed to embroider, not sew, it formed a court case against Howe's, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Howe's 1845 patent. Which brings us to Elias Howe. As mentioned, he patented his machine in 1845, and I would say he was the first to actually sell the machine on a wide scale. His machine was very similar to Fisher and Gibbons, but the fabric was held vertically. Like I said, this is the mention I found, which is strange to me because that feels really difficult to do if you're actually sewing, but I guess it's easier than hand sewing. And having the machine move away from the point, starting at the eye. He stayed in the UK for a while, and upon his return to America, because he was American, he found that a lot of people were infringing on his patent, the most notable of which would have been the man I would argue is probably most synonymous with the sewing machine, Isaac Singer. Isaac Singer patented his machine in 1851. It was based on a machine he saw repaired at a Boston shop, and he designed a better one with a falling shuttle rather than a rotary one, a vertical needle, and it had a press. It also had a pedal that adapted a reciprocating motion, so when you press on a pedal it goes up and down, into a rotary one, like a machine moves. This left both hands free for controlling the fabric, and after Howe's lawsuit, Singer had to pay Howe a lump sum for all machines already produced and take out a license for $1.15 per machine. This then throughout the 1850s, more and more companies sprang up, with new patents being issued and constant lawsuits. This was known as the Sewing Machine War. We'll circle back to this and how it got concluded, but let's talk about a few more players, a few more things that happened during this time. So, Alan B. Wilson also developed a reciprocating shuttle in a short arc, which was better than Singer's or Hoe's. However, he was threatened by John Bradshaw, who had a very similar device patented. He joined forces with Nathaniel Wheeler to produce a machine with a rotary hook instead. This was smoother and quieter than other methods, so Wilson and Wheeler produced more machines in the 1850s and 60s than any other company. And Wilson also produced a 4-motion feed mechanism still used in machines. So it goes forwards, down, back, and then up. So again, that's to do with how the machine moves. And then also in the 1850s, Charles Miller patented the first machine to be able to stitch buttonholes, which isn't really relevant to everything else. But I find it interesting because it's so early for the first machine to stitch buttonholes. Meanwhile, we still had to stitch on actual buttons by hand, at least in my experience. Interesting that that was so early, and then other things, and then we still don't have much help with buttons. We'll go back to the sewing machine war. To conclude the sewing machine war, the sewing machine combination was created, consisting of Singer, Hoe, Wheeler, Wilson, Grover, and Baker. They pooled their patents together and licensed them for $15 per machine. This lasted until 1877, until the last patent expired, which did essentially give these companies a bit of a monopoly over machines, because $15 was a lot back in the 1850s. So if your machine was $15 more than the competition who were in this sewing machine combination, that's a lot of money. And then in going back to 1857, James Edward Allen Gibbs patented the first chain-stitch single-thread sewing machine. He partnered with James Wilcox to form Wilcox and Gibbs sewing machine. Another sewing machine was formed in 1859 by William Jones and Thomas Chadwick. They manufactured machines in Ashton-under-Lyne until 1863, and Thomas Chadwick later joined Bradbury & Co., while Jones opened a factory in Guidebridge, Manchester, also in 1863, which 3 decades later, in 1893, was advertised as the largest factory in England, making exclusively first-class sewing machines. It was later renamed the Johnson Sewing Machine Co. Ltd. and was acquired by the Brother Industries of Japan in 1968. This felt important to me to mention because I would argue that Brother is one of the other main sewing machine companies today, apart from Singer, obviously. And then in 1885, Singer patented the Singer vibrating shuttle, which was superseded in the 20th century by a rotary shuttle, which again is interesting because the rotary shuttle is still used today. My modern machines has a rotary shuttle, and so do my machines from like 1920. Even though they are slightly different, because but that's actually just because my modern one is slightly weird. Or maybe it's what they're switching that to now, but my previous modern one had the same sort of setup as my 1920s one for the shuttle. And then the first electric sewing machine was invented by Singer in 1889, but it wasn't really sold until after World War I, and even then pedal and hand crank machines seemed to be more common, just from my experience of what I've collected, until World War II. But it could also be that my experience is biased due to survivorship bias, wherein electric machines are less likely to stay because they're more likely to break. Because obviously the electrical is more likely to break than simple mechanics. So yeah, either they were just less common until World War II, or survivorship bias. But also the motors weren't actually inside the machine. They were just sort of attached to the machine and spun the machine through a lever strap, which is also sort of how the pedal one works, because if the pedal moves up and down, and then there's a leather strap attaching the bigger wheel at the bottom to the small wheel of the machine. Meanwhile, with the electric, rather than going to a pedal, it just goes to a motor at the back. And this also meant that both hand crank and pedal machines could be retrofitted with a motor. And I do have an example of a machine that is a pedal machine, because it has the pedal underneath, but it also has a motor attached to the back. So that's something that seemed to be fairly common at the time as well. And then electronic machines with microchips and circuit boards were introduced in the 1970s, with, I believe, Elmer machines being the first ones, but now most home machines have chips, mostly to get different sewing patterns or to change the speed of the sewing. So yeah, that's the history of the sewing machine, I suppose. My video next month will be discussing my sewing machines. There's one there, another one over here. I don't know how well I'm pointing. And if you're just here for the history of sewing machines, click off now. But I would like to tack on a section about my random tangents that I fell into during my research of sewing machines. Number 1. Toyomi's machines being protested and destroyed because they were going to take away jobs is very interesting to me, because it's not like anyone feels about that way about sewing machines now, but obviously we do think about that way about AI. How the robots are going to take away our jobs. And I think that is a valid criticism in the system that we live in, and I think it was a valid criticism back then about the system that they live in. But I think obviously it shows that things change, because obviously there used to be so many more tailors, especially in the West, than there are now. So I think it shows that markets change and things will adapt. But also, that doesn't mean I think AI is good. I think AI is bad, mainly for environmental reasons, and also because it's literally making us dumber. But I do think that the reason of it's going to take away our jobs is a dumb one, because that's not really a critique of AI. I would argue that's a critique of capitalism. So, yeah, I think it's fascinating how we just repeat these cycles over and over again. Every single machine has taken away someone's job. That's just how innovation works, I guess. And I'm not entirely against going back to, living off the land and stuff, but I do like Minecraft a lot. So, unfortunately, I can't be that anti-technology. And obviously the machines are also technology, and I have a great love for them, so I will not be completely anti-innovation, but I am anti-AI due to environmental reasons, and also because it's making us dumber. And also because it steals. That's also an important one. It steals people's work. But again, it's all sort of hard to say if that would be a valid critique in a non-capitalist world, because surely when you don't need to own property, when you don't need to get money, does it really matter if something is using your stuff? I guess. I'd prefer to have a community-based sharing system with other humans rather than a sharing system with AIs, because of the many other reasons. But yeah, the stealing is bad. But the taking away jobs, I think, is just a critique of capitalism, and also it's very bad for environmental reasons, and it's making us dumber. But the job reason is dumb, as proven by Toyomi angering the tailors. Random rant number 2, languages. So I had a lot of fun with the languages here, because obviously, to me it was fine, mostly because it was European languages and I can get something there. So for example, we had Krems and Madesperger, Krems being German and Madesperger being Austrian. So a lot of the stuff about them was in German, and I did read some of it in German, because I do speak German. Not great, not very well, but I do, and I can understand it, and I definitely read better than I speak. So that was fun to have to practice my German skills for that. I also ended up on a random collector's website, which ended up not being relevant to anything, but I was hoping that he might have some more information, but it's just a random collector's website. But the website was in Czech. And I'm Polish, which means that I looked at that instead of the first thought, if it was probably most of the languages would have just been to put in Google Translate. No, my first thought was, I'm going to try and read this out loud. And yeah, it turns out if you're Polish and you try and read Czech out loud, you mostly understand what's going on. Even if looking at it doesn't make sense, if you sound out the words, it mostly makes sense. But yeah, no actual relevant information there, just interesting to read and check because I fell into a rabbit hole. And then there's French. I don't know French. I don't understand French. I hate French. Due to school reasons, but I had trouble with it because obviously Thiomé's patent was French. Thomas Stone and James Henderson patent was French, and it's much easier to research these things in languages where the patent was. So I was struggling with French, and I might have missed some information because it's in French. So anyway, I'm learning French now because I need to know. I need to have all the information about sewing machines. If sewing machines are the things that are going to make me learn languages, so be it. So that's my languages rabbit hole. Number 3, my failed London trip. I mentioned it that I went to go to the Science Museum and I ended up not going to and I ended up not being able to see the machine I wanted to see. I did see some other machines that I'll probably be putting images here in this video. So for example, I saw a model of Elias's home machine, first machine, so that was good. And yeah, I think so there are quite a few interesting machines there, but they didn't have the machine I went to go see, which was Thomas Saint's, the model of Newton-Wilson's model of Thomas Saint's machine from 1874, designed 1790. And they didn't have that there, turns out, because it was moved to Sweden or something, and I don't understand, and that's frustrating that on the website it said they had it, and then it turns out they'd moved it. But oh well. And then the second part of my failed trip to London was I went to the Sewing Machine Museum, at which point it turned out it was closed because the only staff member who deals with the tools had broken their shoulder. So no Sewing Machine Museum for me this month. Although I have gone twice before, which is where some of my knowledge comes from. But I was really hoping to brush up on that knowledge and make sure it's correct. So that's unfortunate. If anyone does have the chance to go to the Sewing Machine Museum in London, I would recommend it. It's great, but it's only open like 10 times a year if you're lucky. Because it's open the first Saturday of every month, apart from December and January, for 3 hours between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. And that's, obviously it wasn't open this time when I went in March because of the person with the broken shoulder. I'm not sure if it's open next month because it lines up with Easter, or the month after that because it lines up with a bank holiday. But it's a great museum if you can actually get there. And then because of that, my family decided we're going to Camden, and that was not great because Camden is overwhelming and I couldn't deal with it. I want to sit with my sewing machines and not deal with the fascinating place that is Cyberdog. If you like rave scenes, go to Cyberdog. If you want sewing machines, go to the Sewing Machine Museum. There's your trip to London, I guess. And my last random tangent is about Isaac Singer. It is fascinating, because I was just kind of looking at the history of sewing machines, and then every so often I'd fall onto a random website that'd just be like, Isaac Singer, the womanizing man with 22 children and maybe 3 families, and blah blah blah. It's like, what is going on here? Anyway, apparently he was not great, especially towards women. Yeah, I think he had 22 children, some legitimate, some not, and maybe he had 3 separate families, and also was probably abusive to at least one of them. But yeah, that was really strange to find out just how much people hated him. It was especially strange because I was just reading an article about the article was called Who Invented the Sewing Machine, and it's on the International Sewing Machine Collectors website. And you know, it's just talking about all of these people who put their efforts into the making of the sewing machine, and at the end it just goes, Isaac Singer contributed basic hyperbole, but Isaac Singer contributed basically nothing, and he was just a womanizer and an awful person, and his name should not be associated with sewing machines. And I'm like, okay, calm down. You're probably right, but also, he did make it big and like he did make sewing machines much more, and also his at least his company did, you know, invent the both the rotary shuttle that's currently used and the one before, and also electric sewing machines. And obviously all of these things would have probably been invented eventually anyway, because I think the history of the sewing machine is sort of inevitable, just from how many times it's been invented. It's like crabs in evolution. Evolution will always go back to crabs. Humans will always make a sewing machine. Yeah, it's just interesting that there's such opinions about him. And I also read a BBC article which was about talking about how companies try to seem better than they are to advertise. And they were talking about what they said is Budweiser advertising to non-binary people or something along those lines, which by using their faces on cans. And I think what they were referring to is Dylan Mulvaney, who is a trans woman, being on one bottle of Budweiser, which again is why you can't trust the news, because this is the BBC and they decided to say that rather instead of getting it correctly. They're also talking about I think razors trying to stop toxic masculinity through some of their ads, and yeah, that was not relevant. But they were talking about the history, and they were talking about how how a lot of these companies who made sewing machines would try and advertise to women by being like, look, we're giving you time, and the men were not happy about it. They're like, there was someone who said, why would I get a sewing machine? I married one. You know, I'm pretty sure I've heard that joke about dishwashers before. But anyway, and stuff like that happening when the sewing machine first came out. But I do think the sewing machine did sort of liberate some things, because obviously people had more time, and especially at-home sewing machines meant that women had more time, because a lot of tailors and those people were still men, but when it comes to at-home sewing, that was women mostly. So these at-home sewing machines helped women. And there was also one particular case with there's the sewing machine known as the Defiant, that was specifically advertised to suffragettes, and I really want to get my hands on one now, because that's fascinating to me. But let's circle back to Singer. On the Singer website, it uncritically claims that Isabella Singer, Singer's wife, is believed to be the inspiration for the Statue of Liberty, which is just plain not true. But I guess it's not true. Most likely, the Statue of Liberty was based on old Greek carvings and statues of the goddess of justice, and also the creator of the Statue of Liberty's wife and also mother, depending on where you're looking. But also it seems to have been both, so that's a situation. But that's not the point. The point is, it was definitely not Isabella Singer. And I think what's going on there is an American, went, because obviously the Statue of Liberty was designed by a Frenchman, and was sent to America. And I don't think Isabella Singer was French. It was American herself. I'm pretty sure she just married an American. But I think what happened there is they went, the Statue of Liberty can't be based on a non-American. After all, it's such an American staple. So they based it on So someone just said that it was based on Isabella Singer, because Singer is such a staple of... I think he's such a good example of the American dream. In the way that he created this company and he made machines, but it's also a good old example that people can still know. Because I'm sure there's other people who at the time made such great fortunes, but those companies are no longer really around. Singer is still popular. So I think that's what happened there, but it's not Isabella Singer. Anyway, those are my rants. Thank you for listening if you got this far. I don't know why you would, but thank you. And hopefully see you next month for my video about my individual sewing machines and all of their stories. Bye!